Everyone, my name is Lara Hanson. Welcome to Funding the RAD DAP Strategies webinar for the monthly Aged Care Steps webinar series. Hopefully you have accessed audio for the webinar either through your phone by entering in the access code available on the screen. After doing so, you'll be asked to enter an audio PIN. Alternatively, you can access audio through your computer just using your microphone. If you do have any issues, you can call the 1300 number at the bottom of the screen and hopefully we can sort out any issues that you might have. So today's webinar will go for approximately an hour. What we will do is not make questions available during the webinar, but if you do have a question on any of the content, please enter your question in the chat box, and then what we will do is prepare a Q&A to send out to more participants after the webinar has ended. So just to let you know, that's how we're going to go today. So essentially, funding the RAD DAP strategies, what we're going to look at today is briefly the accommodation agreement. I'm going to look at that because often there's a little bit of confusion as to how we can fund our RAD DAPs given the information contained in that agreement. Now, the agreement is a very highly legislated document. So it's just a matter of looking out for the elements regarding payment methods in the agreement and just understanding essentially the rights of the resident. Speaking of payment options, we're going to have a look at those using a few different case studies. So whether it's paying by DAP, combination or RAD only, looking at a few different case studies to understand exactly how payment options work. We're also going to look at what would happen to use the home to pay for accommodation. It's the age-old example of using your old home to pay for your new home. So how that might work in residential care and the options that might be available. We're also going to look at what happens when the family help out, because our families love us dearly and occasionally want to give us loads of money to pay for our accommodation and our aged care fees, but we just want to look at the issues involved if the family does choose to help out. Also, throughout the presentation, we will generally have a chat about any estate issues in regards to making accommodation payments and how that might impact the estate of a resident once they pass away. Now, today's webinar is going to assume that the clients or case studies are full RAD payers. Now, the same rules do apply to low means residents who pay RACs, but the purpose of today's webinar is just to focus on the RAD payers. Now, if you are a Business Toolkit subscriber, you can watch our February webinar on low means residents to work out sort of types of options and payment options for them and various scenarios available. So that's under the training tab in the toolkit for our toolkit subscribers. Okay, so first of all, the accommodation agreement. Now, this is required by legislation if the resident is paying for their accommodation. So at some stage, generally they will, unless they're low means, but the accommodation agreement must be provided to the resident if they're actually paying for accommodation. Now, it can be a separate agreement or form part of the resident agreement. So either way, there will need to be an accommodation agreement. Now, the whole purpose of the accommodation agreement is to specify the agreed accommodation price or RAD that the resident has agreed to pay. It also then states the maximum permissible interest rate, or the MPIR, which is used to work out the daily cost of accommodation if the resident doesn't choose to pay as a lump sum. Now, that MPIR is set at entry and does belong to the room that the person has contracted to occupy. If perchance they do choose to move rooms or move to another service provider, then the MPIR will be updated to the rate on the date of the new entry into that room or new service provider. So otherwise, it's set at entry whilst you remain in the room that you're in. Now, the resident agreement will also specify that the resident has 3 payment options. Now, they've got 28 days to decide which payment option that they would like to apply to paying for their accommodation. So they can choose to pay as a full lump sum, a RAD, a full daily payment or rental style payment, which is a DAP, or a combination. Now, you have to show an example of a combination payment in the resident agreement, as well on the My Aged Care website where the facilities will advertise their prices. And that's just to let the resident know that they have the choice. So they've got 28 days to decide which payment option they would like to apply to their circumstances. Now, we will talk more about those payment options in a moment, but this purpose here is just to let you know that the resident agreement must show that the payment options are available. It also must specify the type of accommodation that is going to be provided to the resident. So that is detailing the specific room, whether it's a single room, a shared room with an ensuite, or a shared bathroom. So it's really letting the resident know that this is the accommodation that they're agreeing to occupy once they become a permanent resident. It also provides information that the conditions for moving rooms. So moving rooms can be a voluntary move or a non-voluntary move. If the move is voluntary, then essentially the resident just chooses to pay for the cost of the new room. If the reason for the move is non-voluntary, then they can't charge any more than what they're currently paying for their current room. But if the new room does cost less, then the accommodation cost will drop to the lower room price. So just a bit of information there about how accommodation costs might change. There's also information about how the RAD is to be refunded, and also any information about any fees or other amounts that can be deducted from the RAD. Now, these payment options and conditions also apply if you're a low means resident, but the difference with the accommodation agreement is it will spell out this is what you will pay if you're a RAD payer, and this is what will happen if you're assessed as a low means resident, with all the information regarding RACs, DAPs and other information involved there as well. So the resident agreement will contain both, and essentially the resident is contracted to pay the RAD until the service provider is notified otherwise if they're a low means resident. It also will contain some information about financial hardship and the conditions that might apply later on, just in case the resident is having difficulty paying for their RAD at a point in the future. So the accommodation agreement is in place and it is highly legislated. So if you do enjoy reading the Aged Care Act, it's in section 52, so you might want to have a look in your spare time. Okay, so payment options. So we did discuss that a resident does have payment options. It is fully their choice on how they would like to pay for their accommodation. They've got 28 days after signing their resident agreement and moving to decide how they would like to pay. The purpose of this 28 days to choose is to stop service providers selecting the resident on the basis of how they choose to pay for their accommodation. So that's the first reason. The second reason is it gives the resident time to decide how they would like to pay. So whether this is getting financial advice or researching more into the situation, either way, it's saying you're not forced to make a decision on day one because there's a lot going on day one. So we're going to give you 28 days to investigate the options that are available to you and make a choice. Now, as we said earlier, the choices are RAD. That means refundable accommodation deposit, and that means pay that amount in full. If you choose to pay by DAP, that's the rental style payment, so making no lump sums towards the RAD, and we can see an example of calculating the DAP is just at the bottom of the screen. So let's just assume that the RAD was $450,000 and the MPIR was 5.96%. So the way we calculate the DAP is to times the unpaid RAD of $450,000 by the MPIR of 5.96% and divide it by 365. So in this case, the DAP would be $73.48 per day. So essentially the client moves in and they will pay the DAP until they choose to do otherwise. So during that decision period of the 28 days, they will pay DAP default position as you pay rent until you make an alternative decision. Now, if the resident does choose to make a combination payment, then it's up to them the portion of the RAD that they would like to pay. Because remember, the DAP is a function of the unpaid RAD. So let's say, for example, that they decided to pay half of the $450,000 RAD, then the DAP would be based on the outstanding portion of $225,000 times by the 5.96%. So that would reduce the DAP payable on a daily basis. Now, we will see how this works in our case studies going forward, but just always think of the DAP being a function of the unpaid RAD, whatever that amount might be, because any partial payments towards that RAD will reduce the unpaid RAD and therefore reduce the DAP that is payable. Now, with these options, if you do choose to make a combination, then the resident can choose to pay for the DAP from their cash flow or investments, or they could elect to deduct the DAP from the RAD paid. So that just means it's not payable from their cash flow sources, rather it will reduce the amount that they've already paid. Now we'll look at examples of funding the DAP from the RAD a little bit later on, but the thing here is that it's the client's choice of how they would like to pay. Now, if they're not quite sure in that 28-day period what decision to make, then if no decision is made, then the Department of Health will select the DAP option on behalf of the resident. If they're still not sure what option they would like to implement because they haven't worked out this strategy yet, whether it's what to do with the home or investments, then the default position is paying the DAP. So why not make the default position the choice of how to choose to pay for accommodation? Now, the good thing is if you do choose DAP as the default payment in the first 28-day period, then you're not precluded from making a lump sum payment towards the RAD in the future at any time. So whether that becomes a combination choice or whether that becomes a full RAD choice, selecting the DAP in that 28 days means you've got the flexibility to change your mind in the future. Now, if perchance you select the RAD, then you've got 6 months to pay and then 42 days after that, which is the overdue notice. Now, most facilities don't chase you for lump sum payments at that point if you chose this method in your contract, but it has been known for a couple of them to pretty much start legal proceedings to enforce the full payment of the RAD, because that's the contracted choice, so therefore the facility is within their rights to enforce the contracted choice. If the contracted choice was DAP only, then the facility is not in a position to make the resident make a payment towards the RAD at the future at any point in time. Once again, if they make a combination payment and choose a RAD of a certain amount, then they've got 6 months to pay that combination RAD payment as well. So the main option is select DAP because essentially if the resident is unsure, then that gives them the most flexibility to implement their options later on and make any payment towards the RAD if they choose to do so. So given that we've got those payment choices, then it's about saying, well, depending on which one I pick, how am I going to fund my accommodation costs? So this is a really good funding diagram of explaining all the costs that are associated in aged care, and accommodation being part of them and living and care expenses being another part. Now, essentially, we're going to have our own home and our other investments and income sources, which are going to be spread across these two costs. Now, the important thing to note here is how we choose to pay for our accommodation generally has an impact on our ability to pay for our living and care expenses on the right-hand side. So when making the decision of paying for our RAD DAP, we always have to review the right-hand side of how we're going to pay for our ongoing daily care fees and other personal health costs. It's a really important aspect to consider, and we will emphasise this as we're looking at our case studies going forward. So let's have a look at the accommodation side first. Now, we can have a private home. So if we have a client who does have an existing home, then the general premise is how do we use our former home to pay for our new home in residential care? There's a couple of ways we can do that. We could rent the home to create cash flow to pay the DAP. So that's essentially how we could pay the DAP. Alternatively, we could sell or borrow against the home to release equity to pay the RAD. So whether that's paying the RAD in full or whether it's borrowing against the home to pay a partial RAD, that can work out as well. So we can have a DAP or a RAD situation there. Now, if we did a combination payment, we could use the home as well, but we could also look at what investment assets we have available to pay a RAD payment as well. So not only could we release equity from the home, but we could have a look at what investment assets we could release equity from as well. So whether that envisages a full RAD payment or a partial RAD payment, either way, we could look at funding the lump sum from there. Now, if we don't pay the RAD in full, then once again, we have to think about how we're going to fund the shortfall or the remaining DAP. So as explained earlier, we could deduct the DAP from the RAD, as shown in the left-hand corner, or we could use our income sources and use those to pay the DAP. If those income sources are not enough, then we will need to release equity from our investments to pay the remaining DAP as well. Alternatively, the family could also help out to fund any shortfall in paying the DAP or the RAD. So families can help out as well. The one thing I like to point out with this funding model, whether it's the private home, whether it's the investment assets or income sources, or the family, generally the family is the final go-to option. Trying to see if we can fund our accommodation, whether by DAP or RAD or a mixed payment, is really ideal from the resident's own funds first. It's only if that's not sufficient, or they can't liquidate their assets, or the family has different objectives, that the family might be becoming involved to actually pay for the accommodation costs. So really, let's just see if the resident can pay on their own first before getting the family involved, and if not, that's when we have to look at what that contribution with the family might look like, whether it's paying a lump sum RAD or whether it's funding a shortfall and paying the DAP. Now, as we said, however we choose to pay for things for our accommodation, it will impact our ability to pay for our living and care expenses on the right-hand side. So we might have smaller investment asset sources generating income if we release equity to pay the RAD. We might have smaller income streams if, again, we release equity to pay the RAD, but we might have an impact on our DVA and Centrelink entitlement. And that's because any lump sum payments towards the RAD are exempt for Centrelink DVA purposes. So paying a RAD payment might help us out on our income side, but it also might deviate from our ability to generate income if we're releasing equity from investments. Given that we have to pay for our daily care fees, personal incidentals, health costs and home expenses, we need to factor those all in, because the choice that we make to pay our RAD might mean that we can't fund those costs. And if that's the case, we have to go back and revise our funding model to look at how we're going to pay for our accommodation so we can still pay for our ongoing living and care expenses. So really important model there to think about when looking at paying for our accommodation costs. Right, so to explain all of this, we're going to look at a case study. So we've got Jim and Wendy, a nice looking couple there. Wendy seems very happy. She's moving into care because Jim snores like no tomorrow. Actually, that's not the real reason, but Wendy is moving into care and Jim is going to stay in the home. Now, the home's worth $800,000, but Jim is going to stay there. So they might have an issue in that the existing home is not available to fund Wendy's new home. So this means that we have to look outside that funding model and then look at what investments are available. So we have $400,000 in cash, which is currently earning 1.5%, and the RAD that Wendy has been asked to pay is $450,000. So that means using our MPIR of 5.96%, the DAP that's payable is $73.48 per day. Now, looking at what their ongoing expenses are going to be, now this is just the lifestyle and home and health expenses. This is not including Wendy's aged care expenses. It's all up for Jim staying at home to maintain his lifestyle and the home costs, any other health costs, and essentially Wendy's lifestyle costs in care. We're going to look at around $40,000. Now, based on their circumstances, Wendy is not low means, but she's going to have to pay that rate of $450,000. But just remember, she has a choice. So whether she pays as a lump sum, a combination payment, or a daily payment, it's up to her, and she's got that 28 days to decide. So what are the options? Well, if Wendy chose to pay via DAP, well, they do have some income coming in from their cash investments and any age pension investments they might have. Age pension entitlements they might have. If those income sources aren't sufficient, then they do have $400,000 in cash, which they can draw equity down from to essentially fund any of that DAP or other shortfall. They could borrow against their home to pay the DAP. So even though they're not selling the home, they might borrow against it and draw down essentially to fund whatever the DAP might be. Now, if they chose a combination payment, they could look at paying a RAD from investments, and they could look at paying the DAP from their remaining income or drawing down from investments, or they could look at borrowing against their home again to be able to fund the remaining DAP, or they might choose to deduct the DAP from the partial RAD paid. Now, when it comes to paying the RAD in full, well, we can see that they don't have enough money outside of the home to do so. Doesn't mean that they can't pay the RAD in full, but it just means that their options involving paying this would be looking at using some of their cash investments. If they want to retain the current home, then they could look at borrowing the difference of the RAD against the equity from the home, Or Jim might not want to stay in the $800,000 home. He might want to downsize, buy a smaller home where Wendy's moving, and then have the residual proceeds available to pay the RAD. Now, they could ask the family to help, but we're just going to assume in this case that the family is not available to help out. So we're going to look at the options that Jim and Wendy can look at on their own. Okay, so payment options. We're going to look at what they could do if they just chose to pay the DAP only. Now, remember, when we're giving advice, we probably provide them with various options, but what we're going to do is go through those 3 different payment options and what is available to Jim and Wendy. Which one might work at the end of the day is obviously a function of your advice document, but for the purpose of today's webinar, we're just looking at the payment options. Okay, so payment options DAP only. Well, they could pay their DAP from investments. All right, so we know that the income coming in is not sufficient to pay the DAP by itself because we have other fees payable. So we've got the basic daily fee, which is just under $18,500. There's a small means tested fee of around $813, and then the DAP on the $450,000 as a per annum amount is $26,820. So all up fees are $46,124. By the time we have a look at the lifestyle expenses of $40,000, they're truly in a situation where they have a cash flow deficit. So that means that they'll need to fund that deficit or the DAP by drawing down from their cash investments. So remembering, of course, that they had $400,000 in that bank account, so they could simply draw down that shortfall, which does incorporate the DAP from that investment. So that's one option that they could look at. The next option is they could say, all right, well, we want to retain that cash account to allow some liquidity for Jim staying at the home. So what we're going to do is fund the DAP from half of our investment and half of it from accessing a reverse mortgage. Now, the reverse mortgage is assumed to have an interest rate of 6.2% and it's compounded monthly. So for option 2, we're just going to split it 50-50. So we're going to fund half of the DAP from our investment and half of the DAP from drawing down from the reverse mortgage. So that means we're just getting that extra $13,410 coming in from the loan drawdowns, representing 50% of the DAP. Still got the same fees, no changes to the fees there. However, we've just got that extra money to be able to pay for the DAP from the reverse mortgage. So that means our shortfall is just under $21,000. So what we've got there is $400,000 sitting in a bank account, which now can be used to fund that shortfall, but we've had a bit of help of paying for the DAP by drawing down from the reverse mortgage. Now, if perchance they did want to retain that full $400,000 and just accessed it completely to pay the DAP, then we've got the full amount coming in option 3, coming in as a loan drawdown. So we're just drawing down the DAP completely, and that's essentially increasing our income sources coming in. All of our other fees remain the same, and it's just worthwhile pointing out here that the means tested fee will remain the same regardless of whether we borrow 50% or 100% of the DAP costs from our reverse mortgage, and that's because any equity release schemes where we're drawing down a regular amount is not assessable income when calculating our means tested fee for the payment of that fee. So in that case, a slight little typo there in the total fees. I'll fix that one up later, but once again, all the fees are still the same. What we then have is the surplus shortfall for that. So we can now see that funding this means that our shortfall is now $7,500. That means we've still got $400,000 sitting in a bank account that we can fund that shortfall from. Now, this is just an illustration of how the DAP might be paid, not necessarily what the client might do, but just giving you some things to consider there. All right, so what does it look like from a projected net asset position? Well, we've got a little bit of an interesting outcome here in that funding the DAP completely from our cash flow investments gives us the better outcome over the projection period. Now, the reason for this is our cash account only earned 1.5%. So the whole idea is we want to fund the DAP from the investment that earns the less first, because those who earn more, then we've got the ability to generate more income to pay the DAP. Now, as it turns out, they didn't have other investments, all they had was cash. So then we look at the reverse mortgage. Now, if you remember, the reverse mortgage interest rate was 6.2%. So that is higher than the MPIR of 5.96%. So that means we're actually borrowing at a higher interest rate to pay our borrowing, if you'd like to put it that way. Because remember, the DAP essentially is a function of the unpaid RAD, so it's kind of like an interest cost. So the interest costs of borrowing money were higher than the MPIR. So by accessing debt at a higher interest rate to pay the DAP instead of a cash investment, which only earned 1.5%, then what we're doing is we're eating away at our capital more, purely because of the additional interest costs associated with borrowing against that reverse mortgage to pay the DAP. So this can be seen by looking at option 2, which was 50% from the reverse mortgage compared to 100% from the reverse mortgage. So the more that we borrowed against the reverse mortgage with the higher interest rate, the more impact on the client's net asset position at the end of the day. So the moral of this story is, if you are paying the DAP, then try to pay it from investments that earn as less as possible as the MPIR. So in this case, cash earned 1.5%, reverse mortgage, although not an investment, the interest rate was 6.2%. So in this situation, if that's how it works out, well, why didn't or why wouldn't Jim and Wendy use their $400,000 in the bank account? Well, Jim might be saying, well, that $400,000 is actually not available because I need to make sure that I have enough funds to pay for any unexpected expenses or anything coming up. And essentially, I'm really worried about using that money to pay payment towards the RAD, which I can't access. So that might come down to essentially, just simply don't want to liquidate the investment. They do want to keep it. It also might mean that the asset is just not available. It could be liquidated, but it's just simply not available because it's the personal preferences of the owner of the asset, or they might want to retain it as an estate asset rather than redeem and make a payment towards the RAD. So when we're having a look at why we wouldn't actually pay a RAD and might pay a DAP, it's just purely because those assets might not be available. We did mention that we would like to use income sources and drawing down from investments that earn less than the MPIR before we look at debt solutions. But obviously debt solutions would be subject to liquidity and flexibility as well. So we just really have to look at what might be appropriate for the resident. Now, if we are cashing investments to pay the DAP, then once again, we probably want to cash in those that earn lowest first and then preserve those that have growth, because then the combined income and growth of those investments will obviously contribute towards the net asset position over time. But we also need to have a think about, well, if we are drawing down from growth investments, well, is there any CGT implications? So very important. So really, moral of this story, borrowing to fund the DAP really only makes sense if the interest rate on borrowings is lower than the MPIR and those other investments aren't available, or the client simply doesn't want to liquidate them. So that's what you need to look around when looking at debt solutions. Now, we did mention that family could help out, but we'll look at them later on in those funding options. So not quite just yet. All right, so what other payment options are available for Jim and Wendy? Well, we can look at the combination options now. So having a look at this one, remembering, of course, they've got $400,000 sitting in a bank account. So it's really saying, well, how much of that is available to make a lump sum payment towards the RAD? So generally, careful analysis has to be made towards that, and we'll talk about what that might look like later. But just for the purpose of the illustration right now, we'll just assume that we're going to use half of it. All right, so half of it, we're going to make a lump sum payment towards the RAD. And once we do that, we can choose whether to pay the DAP from cash or investments or the DAP from the RAD. So in option 1, we're just going to look at what would happen if we funded the remaining DAP from cash flow. All right, so with this particular case, by paying the $200,000 RAD, Jim and Wendy are now full age pensioners. They weren't quite before, they're about $2,000 off. But with this one, any payments towards the RAD are exempt when calculating settlement benefit. So slight benefit there in that they're now full age pensioners. Now remember, their other income sources have now halved because they've used half of their RAD, half of their cash to pay the RAD. And whilst the service provider has the RAD, Jim and Wendy have no access to those funds or any income that's generated from it to help fund their other fees. So total income is now pretty much just over 50,600. Now the basic daily fee is still just under $18,500, but interestingly enough, the means tested fees dropped to zero. So just before you all think, oh, that's perplexing, because their share of the assets for a means tested fee to kick in is over the threshold of 166,707 as indexed last week. So since Wendy's share of the assets is $200,000, because remember, it doesn't matter where the assets are, everything in the pot divided by 2, then why doesn't she have a means tested fee with accessible assets of $200,000? Well, it's important to note that the means tested fee is only payable if it's more than $1 a day. So for $200,000 worth of assets, her means tested fee is around 91 cents, which means it's less than $1 and not payable. So an important thing to note there, that just because you have over the cutoff area of where a means tested fee might be payable, it might be zero purely because it's not more than $1 a day, which is what happened in this situation. So her DAP, which is payable on essentially the unpaid RAD, is now $14,900. So that's essentially, the DAP payable on the remaining $250,000 that's unpaid, times by the MPIR of 5.96%. So her total fees in this instance is now just over $33,300. So they have reduced if she just paid DAP only. If you remember, it was around $46,000. So essentially the reduction in that fee is the small $813 means tested fee, and obviously the DAP that would be payable on the $200,000 RAD that was just paid. So fees are a lot less, which means that as a result, their cash flow position has now dropped to around a deficit of $22,700. So once again, a lot better if they just did DAP only, paying for cash investments. However, Jim is still a little bit concerned about that cash flow shortfall. So one more thing we can do is look at saying, well, instead of funding that DAP from cash flow, let's deduct it from the RAD paid. And then that way we're removing it from our cash flow, which helps our cash flow position and helps retain our liquid investment outside of the payment. So looking at option 2, this is exactly what we've done. We've said, all right, well, instead of paying DAP from cash flow, we're going to deduct it from the lump sum paid. So no changes to our age pension or other income sources, no changes to our basic daily fee or means tested fee. But we can see our DAP there is now 15,314. And that's purely because when you deduct the DAP from the RAD, most service providers recalculate what the DAP is going to be monthly based on the reducing balance of the RAD. Now we'll see that in a moment in the next slide, but essentially what's happening is it's more than if you just paid the DAP from your cash flow sources, purely because you're accessing a debt solution to pay your DAP, which is then charging you an interest rate for the pleasure of doing so, and that interest rate is therefore compounding monthly, which is increasing the amount that you owe. All right, so we'll see how that works in a moment, but that's why it's around $414 more than if she just paid from cash flow. So total fees have increased with that additional interest cost, but however, our cash flow position is now only a deficit of around $7,800 odd because the DAP is now being taken out of the lump sum paid. So in this instance, the $200,000 sitting in the bank account is quite sufficient to fund that shortfall going forward, and that might provide more security and peace of mind for Jim at home instead of wondering how quickly those assets will be depleted if they deduct the DAP from cash flow as shown in option 1. Now, interesting thing about DAP from RAD strategies is that sometimes it might be more beneficial to pay a higher RAD and deduct DAP from RAD. So in this instance, looking at a $300,000 RAD, so that's leaving $100,000 in the bank account. So once again, a bit of a difference at the top line, still a full-age pensioner, but we've got less income coming in from our remaining $100,000. So our income position is just a little worse off. Still have to pay the basic daily fee, no means tested fee because it's less than $1 a day still. And we can see that the DAP is actually lower because it's based on the 150 outstanding in this case, rather than option 2, which was the 250,000 outstanding. Now we're still compounding the DAP monthly in this case, so the DAP in this instance is $9,188. So the fees are a little lower because we've paid more towards the RAD. Because remember, the DAP is a function of the unpaid RAD, so the more we pay, the smaller the DAP is. So in this instance, fees are a little bit lower, and because we're taking the DAP from the RAD, our cash flow position is a shortfall of around 9,300. Now, what we're doing is we then have to sort of have a think about, well, we've got 100,000 left in the bank account in that option. How's that going to fund that shortfall going forward? So we'll look at have a comparison all of that in a moment, but what we'll just do is go back to option 2 and have a chat about an example of how that DAP is recalculated each month. So this is just a screenshot from our DAP from RAD calculator. So the year summary of 15,314 is just circled there, just to show you that that's what the compounded interest cost is over the year. Now it is calculated monthly, as we mentioned earlier. So we can see in the month summary in the section at the bottom half of the screen that the value of the RAD paid in month 1 was $200,000. Unpaid RAD was $250,000, so the DAP based on the $250,000 unpaid was $1,242. So once we took that off the RAD, that meant the RAD balance at the month end was $198,758. So that balance rolls forward to the next month. We can see at the beginning of month 2 to say, well, that's the value of the paid RAD at the beginning of month 2. That means the unpaid RAD is always a function, remember, of what the RAD is less anything that's been paid. So the unpaid RAD is now $251,242. So calculating the DAP on that new unpaid RAD balance is $1,248. So that means that the RAD balance at the end of month 2 is $197,510. So on and so forth. So the accumulated value is 15,314. So that's how the compounding interest works for calculating the DAP from RAD. Good thing to know about DAP from RAD is care providers must accept this arrangement. So looking back to the accommodation agreement before, it will stipulate that the DAP can be deducted from the RAD at the resident's request. So they have to accept that arrangement. Now, it can be a strategy to manage cash flow. So we saw that with Jim and Wendy, that they're a little concerned about funding the DAP from cash flow. So thought, well, if we deduct it from the lump sum paid, that eases the pressure on cash flow and it gives more security to the remaining pool of assets. So we can use the locked away pool if you want to view it that way, but not the accessible pool. So that locked away pool, meaning the RAD, is available for the DAP, but it's not available for other expenses. So it's not accessible for everything else. But we can actually use it to pay the DAP if required. We did mention, remember, it's not a strategy to reduce overall cost due to the compounding interest. So we saw with the $200,000 payment compared to paying from cash, where the DAP was $14,900. We saw that if we paid a $200,000 from the DAP from the RAD paid, that increased our DAP for the year to $15,314. So once again, $414 worth of interest costs for the pleasure of deducting the DAP from the lump sum paid. So it is a short-term or a long-term fix. You can start and stop as required. So generally with this type of strategy, you might not do it at the start, but what you might consider is, well, when the cash reserves get a little bit low, you might start the strategy at that point to help boost up cash reserves until the cash reserve is replenished. Having a look at the outcome for Jim and Wendy, we can see, strangely enough, from a net asset perspective, that paying the 300,000 RAD and doing DAP from RAD was actually better than paying a smaller amount of 200,000 and taking from cash or from the lump sum paid. Now, the reason for that is the more that we pay towards the RAD, the smaller the DAP, which is non-refundable over the projection period. So in this instance, even though we paid a higher amount, we actually reduced the DAP that was payable. So if you remember, it was around 9,000 odd compared to 14,900 and around 15,000 for the other options. So the more that we can look at reducing the DAP, which is non-refundable, and making sure that we can fund our cash flow going forward, then the better position on our net asset position, because that means we're funding less DAP over the projection period. So when you're looking at DAP from RAD strategies, if you're doing a 200,000 comparison, so we can see from cash, so funding it from cash was better than from the RAD because the cash interest rate was 1.5%, whereas the interest rate on funding from the RAD was 5.96%. So when you're looking at the 200,000 compared side by side, if you can fund it from lower earning investments first, then great. and then revert to your DAP from RAD. However, if you can pay a higher amount towards the RAD and not obviously expensive cash flow in the person at home, then that might mean it's got a better example or a better outcome over the projection period. All right, so just something to consider when you're formulating your strategies for those combination payments. All right, so once again, when you're working out the lump sum, make sure that there's adequate cash reserves to maintain liquidity over projection periods to meet other expenses. Remember, if the cash reserve is a problem, you can then consider DAP from RAD strategy unless you can find an alternative debt solution which is cheaper. Because remember that 5.96% is the interest cost for DAP from RAD, but if you could fund it from drawing down from your home and it was only an interest rate of 5% or other debt solutions, then that might be more appropriate. If you are doing a DAP from RAD, as we saw, a higher RAD payment might actually provide a more favourable projected asset outcome. But once again, if you are looking at a higher payment, then you might need to really make sure that you have adequate cash reserves to maintain that liquidity going forward. Important thing to note, if the RAD does run out at some point in the future, then the DAP reverts to being funded back from income and other investments. So once it's gone, it goes back to being taken out of cash flow. All right, so we're going to look at some payment options now to pay the RAD in full for Jim and Wendy. So really in this case, we're not getting the family involved, but we're going to pay the RAD in full using $300,000 from cash and borrowing $150,000 from a reverse mortgage at 6.2%. Now, interestingly enough, in this one, essentially, we set to please come back, so we have got that there. That's due to essentially borrowing another $150,000, which is offset against an asset which is not accessible, the home, but the RAD is accessible. So we've increased our accessible asset pool by $150,000 when calculating the excessive fee. So that's why that's gone up. However, no longer have a DAP, and our shortfall is around $10,500. Now, if Jim decided to downsize the home and pay the RAD in full with $150,000 in cash and $300,000 from the sale proceeds, we can see the position there once again that no DAP, the mean excessive fee has gone up, and that's because all of those residual proceeds of $300,000 are going to be assessed, which weren't assessed in the option on the left-hand side. So that's why we have a higher mean excessive fee. Cash flow shortfall is pretty similar, just under $9,000. So, this decision would really be about, well, Jim, do you want to stay where you are? Or if you downsize, well, the go-to position would be paying the RAD in full, because obviously the more we can pay towards the RAD, the less the DAP and the better the impact on our net asset position over time. All right, so looking at this one, if you were to downsize, that would provide the better outcome. And that's really just a matter of, looking at, what the home is doing as opposed to funding, funding the RAD from proceeds from the home and cash, so no debt costs associated. If we kept the current home and funded the remaining RAD of $150 from debt, then we've got the interest costs. So we don't have those interest costs of downsizing the home because we didn't borrow money to pay the RAD. So by borrowing money, the accumulation of the compounding of those interest costs just means it's eating into the equity of our home over time and reducing net value of our asset position. So it's just really something to have a think about when you're looking at that one, looking at the debt costs compared to the MPIR and having a look at the situation and seeing what works for the client. All right, so just something for them to consider. So when making a RAD payment, and this applies whether it is partial or full, just remember to think about the client's cash reserves. Think about any other upfront costs that they need to spend right now. So if they're renting their home, selling their home, or have to pay for any other immediate expenses, you want to make sure you don't overpay the RAD at the expense of not being able to fund those. You look at your return on investments relative to the MPIR. Well, we always look at the lower earners first. And then essentially only resort to debt solutions if we don't have enough, and consider capital gains tax if we have to draw down from investment. The other thing to think about is estate planning issues as well, because any amounts paid towards the RAD are refunded back to the estate. All right, let's look at using the former home now. So we're going to look at Barbara. So Barbara is single, living at home. Home worth $800,000, costs $5,000 to maintain. She could rent it out for $26,000 with costs of $8,000, including land tax, and she has 100,000 in the bank. The rate is 450,000, so we have to think about what options are available for her. So we've seen the DAP options, the mixed options, and the pay in full options in the previous case study. So those options are available to Barbara as well. But because she has a home and she's single, it means that she has 2 years from moving out that the home is exempt from the Centrelink assets test. At that point in time, the full value of 800,000 will count towards the asset test when determining her age pension, which, based on the information above, she is a full age pensioner. So we do have to have a think about, what might happen when she loses that exemption. Okay, so here are some options of using the former home. Now, because she had 100,000 in the bank account, we've just decided that a combination option, if the home is retained, is not suitable for Barbara, purely because she wants to maintain 100,000 for flexibility and future cash flows. So that's just something again to consider about whether that 100,000 is available. Right, so if she retained the home and paid DAP only, then her situation would be, once everything else is considered, a shortfall of around $31,000. So that's her option if she retained the home. She's actually not using the home to pay for her DAP at all because she's been retained and left vacant. If she decided to rent the home out and generate some income and pay DAP only, then she's got the rental income of $26,000 coming in. Unfortunately, rental income is assessed under the income test for people going into care today, so that has dropped her age pension to just under $16,000. Renting the home out means the means tested fee is going to be higher because rental income will also count in that circumstance. So all up, by the time we consider all of those expenses, she's got a shortfall of around $20,000. So once again, 100,000 in the bank, and we have to see how that can be used to fund that shortfall. Alternatively, she could sell the home and pay the rate in full, and by doing this, she will receive around $19,000 in age pension, purely because any amounts paid towards the RAD are exempt, as you remember. So it's only the residual proceeds that will count there. The means tested fee will go up quite considerably because the full 800,000 proceeds of the home will be accessible when calculating that fee, regardless of what she does with the proceeds. So even though she used to pay the RAD, the full 800,000 will be assessed as an asset, and then essentially the income component based on what's done with the funds. The reason why it's lower on the left-hand side where we retain the home is, remember, only the cap value of the home is going to be assessed whilst you retain it for means tested fee purposes. So all up, by the time we have a look at it, she's got a shortfall of around $12,000. So there's some options with the home. But once again, we have to think about, if we retain the home, are we going to have any problems in 2 years' time when the Centrelink asset test exemption expires to pay that DAP? She sells the home, doesn't have the problem, the RAD's paid in full, and she's got quite a load of funds that are sitting there in her bank account. So let's have a look at what might happen. So we can see from a projected cash flow position that if we sold the home, which is the line up the top, our cash flow remains fairly consistent. Now, remembering that we had essentially around, I'll just do my arithmetic, we have about 450,000 in the bank account in option 3 once we've sold the home and paid the RAD in full. So $450,000 is more than enough to fund her cash flow shortfall over those projection years. So that means by paying the RAD in full, the impact on being able to pay her other fees meant that there was still completely able to fund it. Now, if she retained the home and didn't rent it out, then she has 100,000 in the bank account, if you remember. Now, at the end of 2 years, when the Centrelink asset test expires, you can see a massive drop in cash flow to around a deficit of $56,500. Now, at that point, she probably has about 40,000 in the bank account, which is not going to last on to the end of projection year 3. So she's going to have to think about, well, in projections year 4 and 5, how am I going to fund that shortfall, which contains the full DAP of $26,000. So again, it's something to consider about, how's she going to fund it at that point. The same thing happens to a certain extent in option 2 where she kept the home and rented it out. In 2 years' time, when the asset counts, you can see that the pension that she was receiving probably not eligible anymore either. But the difference with renting the home is because she did rent it for 2 years, the impact on her cash account, she's got about $60,000 sitting in the bank account at the end of year 2, which means she could probably fund her shortfall for years 3 and 4 and then having to work out, well, how's she then going to fund her remaining expenses from year 5 onwards. So definitely has to think about, well, how am I going to fund that? So obviously, back to our funding model, we could use the equity in our home. So in option 1, we could start to rent it out. We can see in option 2 that that's still causing a problem. So we might need to investigate further options for option 1. So we might look at drawing down equity from our home in option 1 if we decide to keep it to get the shortfall, back up to a manageable level. So whether it's reverse mortgage, or we could look at the pension loan scheme, which is on the next slide. So just leave that for a moment, or whether the family can help out. Now those types of things would also apply if we kept the home. We might need to sell it at the end of year 2 to be able to keep funding our fees, drawing down equity from it, or getting the family to help out. We couldn't do the DAP from RAD in options 1 and 2 because we didn't make a partial RAD payment. But if we had, that might also be another solution of how to fund the DAP at that time. All right, so here's just some brief information on the pension loan scheme. At the moment, you can borrow up to 100% of the age pension, and it's limited to some self-funded retirees and part pensioners and their partners. So really it's just in the case of Barbara, that once she loses the age pension, she could use the pension loan scheme to top it up and replace the amount that she lost. The interest rate there is 5.25%, so it might be a bit cheaper than looking at reverse mortgage options where the interest rates might be higher. There are proposed changes to the pension loan scheme. So proposed from the 1st of July 2019 means that the scheme will be open to everybody over pension age, and essentially can borrow up to 150% of the age pension, less pension received. So it's just something to think about, that the pension loan scheme might be an appropriate way to fund any shortfall. So looking back at Barbara, let's just assume option 1, where the home was not rented and it's 2 years' time. So she has $40,000 in the bank. The home's worth $840,000, so not eligible for the age pension anymore. As mentioned, she could sell, rent or borrow, but she could also borrow from a pension loan scheme. So currently, she would lose the age pension, so she could replace that up to $23,824. So she did access that scheme in 2 years' time, then she could fund her cash flow for a further 18 months. So using that $40,000 in the bank and then accessing the pension loan scheme means that another 18 months she can fund her shortfall until she's actually forced to make a decision regarding the home. Now, with the proposed borrowings, she could then borrow up to 1.5 times the single age pension, so that's just under $36,000. So if she implemented that scheme in 2 years' time, she could fund her cash flow for a further 2 years. So she's got 4 years that the money would last. So once again, an option that she could look at if she retained her home and left it empty and didn't want to rent it out, that pension loan scheme might be appropriate. Important thing to note, however, you might be limited by your licensee because it is a debt product. You have to have a credit license. So if you do want to look at using the pension loan scheme, the client will need to speak to a Centrelink Biz officer to get information about the pension loan scheme. I mean, you can mention generic debt products. So you might say, well, if you assume you could borrow at 5.25% compounded fortnightly, this is what it might look like. All right, but you can't mention it by name. Okay, so now we're going to look at family help. So now we have Bernie, and the family would love to keep the home, so they don't want to use the home to pay for his accommodation costs. So he has $80,000 in the bank, and he has a RAD of $350,000. So family, because they do want to keep the home, should they pay the RAD or pay the DAP, or should they rent the home? So these are some decisions that the family can make. So let's just assume that the family decides to pay the RAD by borrowing. So it's the full $350,000. So what's going to happen is his means tested fee is going to go up. Because remember, if you borrow money, whether it's from a reverse mortgage or a family member, the loan cannot be offset against the RAD paid. So therefore, it increases the level of assessable assets. Now, the family might have been able to get a secured loan against the home, but remember, the loan is not accessible for Centrelink for 2 years, and only the cap value for aged care. So securing against the home might not make any difference for that means tested fee right now. However, the DAP's no longer payable. Given everything else with his expenses, he'll have a shortfall of just under $10,000. The family could rent the home because this is something that they used to do. Remember, if you rent the home, any rental income counts towards the Centrelink income test. So in this case, if they were to rent the home, which is the amount of the DAP, so that just DAP is rent. So rent is $20,860 on the $350,000 outpaid. So that means that he wouldn't be a full age pensioner purely because if the family rented the home, that would become assessable income. The mean assessed fee, however, will be a lot lower because it's only based on the rental income, not the increased lump sum compared to option 1, where that $350,000 was borrowed. Still have to pay the DAP, obviously, and the shortfall is around $14,000. Now, if the family chose to do a periodic payment, now this is different to rent because a periodic payment from a close family member for Centrelink purposes is not assessable income under the Centrelink income test when calculating age pension and means tested fees. So if the family is a close family member, usually one up, one down, one sideways, grandkids generally count, but you might want to check it out, then don't let them pay rent because rent is assessable. And that's also going to trigger land tax because land tax is payable whether it's rented to a family member or whether it's rented commercially. So always think about that. However, if the family decide to make a periodic payment, so we're not calling it rent, it is a periodical payment from an immediate family member, not assessable, still a full age pensioner. So that's coming in, so they're getting the periodic payment coming in, and that also means that it's not going to impact their means tested fee because it's not assessable for that purpose either. So by doing that, then the shortfall is around $4,000. So with these options, it's about saying, well, you know, given those circumstances, how long would we be able to fund that shortfall going forward? So remember, you know, he does have some money sitting there in the bank account, but it's just a matter of working out where that's going to be funded. Okay, sorry, I meant to go back and just have the chat. So remember that $80,000. So we're going to have to think about the problem in 2 years' time. So 2 years' time could be a problem. Okay, so this is the 2 years' time. I was just looking for the slide. Sorry, I just confused myself there. So in 2 years' time, the impact of the home being assessed in this case meant that he was going to lose his age pension. So if in option 1, where the family paid the RAD in full, here's $80,000 in the bank account, probably going to be gone somewhere in year 4. So at that point, if they want to help out, you would say, well, you might need to start paying a periodic payment at that point. In option 2, where they're paying rent, we can see the shortfall. So we would say, well, we wouldn't want to call it rent anyway, but let's just say we did. Family members, you're going to have to pay more rent probably from about year 4 onwards because the $80,000 is no longer going to be available. If in option 3, we call it a periodic payment, we can still see that he's going to lose his age pension in year 3, but he still has $80,000 sitting in a bank account. So he could probably fund himself to the end of year 4 before we need to ask the family to help fund some more money by a periodic payment. So once again, however we choose to pay for it, then we're going to have to look at the impact of the home in 2 years' time and see how we might have to change that strategy. Okay, so things to consider. Sorry, I'll just flip back to that other slide. So if you do want the family member to help out, just remember we want it to be a periodic payment, not rent, because exempt. If the home is rented, so if it's not an immediate family member, therefore not eligible for the exemption. If you do rent it, then don't forget that land tax may apply depending on the value of the home. Just remembering if the family are paying the RAD goes back to the estate. So how's that family member going to get the money back? The interesting thing is can the enduring power of attorney, if the person does not have capacity, actually be able to enter into a loan agreement in the first place? So if the answer is no, then it might be, well, do we have a loan agreement with the other siblings, considering that the RAD will go back to the estate as cash? So you have a loan with the siblings to say, come estate time, the loan, you will owe me essentially this amount each of the RAD. If the person doesn't, if the person does have capacity, can they change their will to allow the repayment of the funds back to the family member? Just remember the means tested fee will increase, so no longer offset. And don't forget the opportunity cost to the family. So you need to consider their borrowing costs or opportunity loss if they're using investments, so it's income and growth loss, when you're looking at the outcome, you know, for the family member. All right, so definitely need to consider that. So just remember the whole estate issue is just to avoid the blended family headaches, because remember the RAD does go back to the estate as cash. So let's just assume that Barbara and Bernie were married. Bernie has dementia. That means he doesn't have capacity to change his will. Now, whilst they're alive, it's everything in the pot divided by 2, regardless of ownership, for calculating age pension and means tested fees. So in this case, what would happen if Barbara used her assets to pay Bernie's RAD? So remember, Bernie does not have capacity to change his will. So she's thinking she's doing the right thing, helping him out. But upon death, the RAD that was used with her funds goes back to his estate, and his estate leaves his, his assets to his children. They're all thinking this is absolutely fantastic. And over there on the other side, Barbara's daughter is a bit upset about this, purely because obviously she no longer gets her inheritance. So just remember, with blended families, always ask about the assets, always sort of just completely remind them that anything that's paid with the other person's funds towards the RAD of the person going into care will go back to that person's estate. So is that going to cause an issue with a blended family when it comes, when essentially in this case Bernie passes away? So this might mean that for these cases that it might be the payment option is DAP only, because the assets are available, but we don't want to pay the RAD to avoid transferring assets. So just another thing to think about if it's a blended family when thinking about the payment options, whether it's DAP combination or RAD payment. Okay, well that's all for today. So once again, the next steps is not to forget that the Q&A. So if you did have any questions about today's webinar, we will put together a document and send out early next week. So just to let you know that. We will be sending out the CPD certificate for those of you who did attend today. And next month's webinar is on Friday the 19th of October. I can tell you that the topic is going to be retirement villages. So everything you wanted to know about retirement villages, that will be next month's webinar. So we hope to see you there. So once again, thanks everybody for attending and have a good day.